heard the melody until I needed a song. So in each of these things, there's aside from the rhyming itself creates texture, creates cohesion, because when you hear the end of the first line and you know the second line is going to rhyme to it, you're kind of waiting for it, and then you tie the two together in your mind. Cohesion is all created, actually all meaning is created in your mind, but especially we're going to be talking about cohesion is created in your mind. It's not in the text itself, but because of something like a rhyme, or in this case, you also have these kind of lexical collocations, so things that kind of go together. When you hear things that go together normally in your sense of your understanding of the world, so like morning and night are kind of opposites, right? They're kind of things that go together to a certain extent. Sunshine is a kind of light. A hometown, and you go away from hometown is kind of this thing, and then melody and song, they're kind of the two words for the same thing. All of these help create cohesion. In other words, help you to put the thing all together in your mind as a single text. And so that's why I thought I would play the song. And so as I mentioned, it goes back, the idea of text itself goes back to the Latin, actually the verb is texere, to weave. So weave, texere becomes textus, which means a thing that's woven, or a thing, you know, and so this is how, you know, when you text your friends on your phone, you're actually using that word, which comes from, it means a piece of cloth or a woven item, right? Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to give you some things that Halliday has talked about in terms of things like this. He doesn't talk so much about rhyme, but he talks about these lexical collocations, and he talks about ellipsis, you know, leaving things out, and reference, different types of reference. So even just having this I over and over again, to a certain extent, also ties it together. But there are other things that help you to create cohesion. So I'm going to read you a story. I don't know if you've heard this before, but if you haven't heard it, listen to it and try to make sense of it. The procedure is actually very simple. First, you arrange things in different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. Soon, however, it will become just another facet of life. It is difficult to foresee any end to the necessity for this task in the immediate future, but then one can never tell. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will then have to be repeated. However, that is part of life. Does that make sense to people? Does anybody have an idea what we're talking about? What if I tell you it's about doing laundry? So now you know the topic is laundry. Now listen again. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that's the next step. Otherwise, you're pretty well set. It's important not to overdo things. That is, it's better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. Soon, however, it will become just another facet of life. It's difficult to foresee any end to the necessity for this task in the immediate future, but then one can never tell. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will then have to be repeated. However, that is part of life. It makes a huge difference whether you know the topic or not, right? So the second time you heard it, you can understand what's being referred to by all of those things when we talk about facilities, or we talk about a mistake can be expensive as well. Like if you put the laundry and too much in or something, it could get mangled up. So all of these things, having this kind of topic allows you to create cohesion, allows you to make sense of how things fit together within the text. So all of that cohesion is in your mind. It's all in your mind. And I would argue that all meaning is created in your mind, but we won't go that radical here. We'll just say that the cohesion is created in your mind. And then that's what we're going to talk about. So let me go to that. Close tabs. Wait. Hey, where'd my mouse go? Hey. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, before that, I want to mention a lovely article in our magazine, Horizons, which is about research in School of Humanities and Social Science. And there's a nice article and has a picture of our lovely Amanda about her MA research. And not only do I, is it nice, yes, applause for Amanda for being wonderful, but it's also, the reason why I'm mentioning it is because she wrote about English policy here, and then the attitudes of people who, she analyzed linguistic insecurity, a phenomenon where a speaker's negative perception of hers or her own speech in comparison to the superior variety can lead to an obsession with the standard form and a discrimination against those who do not conform to it. So this is kind of what I've been arguing against in saying that you can do things with language. It's not a fixed form. It's not something that's written in stone and you can't change it and you can't play with it and you can't do things with it. So this is what she's been writing about. So when you get to ask her about her thesis and some of her, or if you can find this magazine, it's free on campus. You can read about a little bit about her thesis. Okay, so cohesion, what I've been talking about, is the semantic relationships that are seen to hold between parts of a text that hold the text together as a text, that is, make it cohesive. Cohesive means like to stick, right? It's like you glue something. That's an adhesive. So adhesive is a type of glue, means it stick to something. But cohesive means co is in the sense of like together. So stick together. Adhere, it means to stick to something. But co-adhere or cohesive means for two things to stick together, or more than two things in this case. So Halliday talks about 4 so-called non-structural resources that are important to cohesion. Now, they're non-structural means they're not like, they are in the grammar to a certain extent, but they aren't like words and sentences and things. They are things that help you to create the cohesion in your mind rather than being kind of a straightforward marker of it. So one is reference, how you refer to things or people. Another one is ellipsis or substitution, when you leave things out. Now this seems very strange, but when you leave things out, it actually creates cohesion because, with substitution, it means when you substitute, like say, do you think John will come today? And you could say, I think so. That so replaces John will come today. So instead of saying, I think John will come today, you say, I think so, where so replaces John will come today. And so in order to understand what so means, you have to think back to what the other person said, and then you create that cohesion by linking back like that. Conjunction, we talked a lot about conjunction when we were talking about interclausal connections, where you can have overt marking of these things like in that case, or anyway, or so, or whatever. And then you have lexical cohesion, like the type of thing I was just talking about with the song, where you say like night and morning and night, or song and melody. And these are types of lexical cohesion because they're all within a kind of a semantic domain, or what we call a frame, semantic frame. And so they create a certain cohesion. Now, as I mentioned, he says these are not structural resources because the cohesion is actually not created by these resources. Instead, the cohesion is created in your mind because in order to understand things that are referred to or things that are left out or whatever, you need to make a link in your mind between two parts of the text, and that creates the cohesion. So given the forms of reference, including ellipsis and substitution and the conjunctions, then we kind of guess what the speaker's intention is in saying those things. And then we can draw connections between the different parts of the text to create a coherent text. So let me just go through these in more detail. So reference basically just is referring to something, so talking about something. So when we want to talk about participants, the things, facts, phenomena, etc., we use different forms, and we don't use the same form over and over again generally. We use different forms. So when you first mention something, you know, newly introduced means like when the first time you mention it, you'll usually use a full word, like a little boy, the man who lives upstairs, Mr. Sam Smith, a teacher at the university. In some cases, when I say anchored by a relative clause, when you say something like the man who lives upstairs, adding the relative clause who lives upstairs helps you identify which man. So we sometimes call that an anchor, and especially with if it's something that you are just introducing for the first time, like a guy I work with, it helps the hearer to understand why you're talking about that person. Once you've mentioned it, the referent becomes what we call identifiable. In other words, the hearer knows who you're talking about. So then you don't have to use a full noun phrase all the time. In some cases, they'll be identifiable not because they've been mentioned, but because they're kind of common knowledge, like when you say the sun, or the classroom, or the university. So there you will have something, a type of deictic marking, like the president, my mother, your childhood, the sun, the table. So these things are identifiable because they're either something that is general knowledge, like the sun, or it's contextual knowledge, like the president, when we mean the president of the university, or I say the table, when I mean the table in this room. And then there's so-called inferentially identifiable things. When you talk about a book, you can mention the index of the book without having to say, oh, there is an index in the book, because we all kind of know that there's an index in the book, so you can just say the index. Or like you say, I bought a refrigerator, but the door was broken. So I can say the door because you know everybody has an idea of how a refrigerator looks, and all refrigerators have a door. It would be kind of useless if it didn't have a door. So you can refer to the door, and people will know that it means the door of the refrigerator. And if it's available in the context, or if it's been mentioned just immediately preceding, then you can use a deictic pronoun or a demonstrative pronoun, like if I say that, meaning that table, or I say this thing in my hand, this. Or you can talk to an idea that was just mentioned, or, you know, that's a difficult concept to understand when referring to the concept I just mentioned. And then I, you, and he are situationally or textually accessible. So I always refers to something to do with the speaker. You always refers to something to do with the hearer, or it can be used in a kind of general sense, meaning anybody. And then he or she or it refers to somebody who's not the speaker or hearer, basically, or nothing to do with them. And as often, in many languages, the third-person pronoun, what we call the third-person pronoun, like he, she, and it, just comes from a word meaning that. In English, we've borrowed some of our third-person pronouns, but if you look at like Cantonese koi or Hokkien I, these come from demonstrative pronouns. Or Latin, when you say like the actually in English also comes from a demonstrative pronoun, that means that. And then in Latin, Romance languages like la and le in French, they come from demonstrative pronoun also. If something is what we call an active referent, in other words, it's most recently mentioned, in most languages, you can just have a zero pronoun, which means it's just not mentioned at all. So, if I say, John woke up in the morning and then brushed his teeth, so it's, instead of saying John woke up in the morning and John brushed his teeth, I can just leave out the John and just say John woke up in the morning and brushed his teeth. So you're leaving out and kind of unnecessary repetitions, because that's the topic under discussion. In English, we often use unstressed pronouns because English marks the mood of the clause using the position of the subject, and so very often we will use unstressed pronouns. Many other languages don't have unstressed pronouns. So when you use a pronoun, you only use it when you really need it, which means when you're switching topics. Now, if you read the textbook, and I hope you are reading the textbook. I know it's difficult. I noticed from some of the questions I've been getting, it seems not everybody's reading the textbook. But some people are making an effort at it, and some people are also reading the Thompson book, which I suggested is a more simple explanation of at least the theoretical aspects, although it doesn't cover as much as Halliday's, and so that's why I don't use it. The discussion of reference in the textbook is mostly the relationship between the first mention of a referent and the subsequent mention. So when you say, I saw Peter at the store and talked to him for a while, so here Peter and him both refer to the same person, right? It's not that him refers to Peter, the word Peter, but they both refer to the person Peter, right? So this is what we call co-reference. In other words, the same co is in cohere. It's co means together, so they both refer to the same person. Our inference, and it is just an inference, there's nothing in the grammar that forces the interpretation that him refers to Peter, but it's just kind of a common sense thing that if the only person we've mentioned and then we talk about some guy, then we're going to assume that the guy we just mentioned is the guy that's referred to by him. There's nothing in the grammar, though, that forces that interpretation. It could be anybody. The him could refer to anybody. It's just in our mind, we make that connection. It's really just an inference connecting these two. And generally, when you mention it again, it will be coded with some sort of pronoun or noun group with a definite marking, like he, him, his, that, it, the book. And the relationship between the first lexical mention and a referent and pronominal reference is broken down into three types. So when we talk about co-reference, when we talk about a pronoun and a noun kind of referring to the same person, we talk about it in terms of the relationship between the two things. So when we talk about anaphora or anaphoric, which ana means up or back in Greek, and for means to carry. So anaphoric means you kind of carry it back. So when you hear something like, I saw Peter at the store and talked to him for a while, when you hear the him, you have to think back to who was just mentioned, and then you say, oh, the him probably refers to Peter, the same person. Not to the word Peter, but to the person Peter. So that's what we call anaphoric reference or anaphora. And then cataphoric reference is where the order of the two elements is the opposite. So cata means actually they go down. So you have one that means going back up, one that means going down. Because if you look at a written page, one would be, if this was on this is higher than this one. So kind of anaphora is going back up to look for that. Cataphora means to look down. So if you say, like, before he left New York, Jim had never been away from home, here the he comes before Jim. Now again, there's nothing in the grammar that forces a co-referential interpretation, but most of the time, because we haven't mentioned anybody else, it could be, if earlier in the text we'd mentioned someone else, then we might assume that he refers to that person. But in this case, if we haven't mentioned anybody else and we say before he left New York, Jim had never been away from home, then we would assume that the he refers to Jim. And so here, in order to understand who the he is, we have to look down. That's why you call it cataphoric, because it means like carry down. So you have to go down to see who's being talked about. And then there's exophoric reference, where the exo is the same as like exit. And exit means to go out. So exophoric means to carry out. There is no previous or subsequent lexical mention. It just means it's kind of by itself. So if I just say this, where I haven't talked about this at all, but I just say this because it's available in the real world, then it's exophoric. Or if I talk about something that we kind of all know about, like the president or the king or the table, then that's exophoric reference. Okay, I've already kind of said this. And this, when you do this throughout a text, if I keep telling you, if I say, John got up in the morning and he brushed his teeth, and then he walked to the kitchen and he made himself some coffee, and then he did his laundry, and then he walked to the car. There's this whole chain of reference of referring to the same person, either as topic, where you say he, or brushed his teeth, where you have the his is also referring to him in a way, and then made his breakfast. So throughout the text, you'll have this chain of reference through the text, linking the parts of the text together. And the reason why we see it as a cohesive text is we assume that the he is referring to the same person. That's not the same in all languages. So like, I remember a friend of mine was learning Burmese, and he was talking to a Burmese person, and he said, I want to test my Burmese on you. I want to try to say a little story and see how my Burmese is. And then he used the pronoun in Burmese the way we would in English. So he said, oh, so he did this, and he did that, and he did this. But in Burmese, you don't use a pronoun if it's the same topic. You just leave it out, and then the cohesion is created by leaving it out, which we're going to talk about in a minute, this ellipsis. So at the end of the story, the Burmese guy said, well, that was really great, but who are all those people? In other words, every time he said he, the Burmese guy thought it was a different person, because like in Chinese, when you say the third person pronoun, you only use it in a stressed way, not in an unstressed way like in English. Because in English, we have a difference between, you know, he did this, and he did that, and he did this, and blah, blah, blah. So that's all unstressed. But if you say, he did it, not him, that's stressed pronoun. Those are quite different in English. And in many languages, you only use the stressed type. So like in Burmese, or in Chinese, if you keep saying, you know, 他怎么样, 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 those are three different people. They're not the same person over and over again, you know, doing different things. So it depends on the language, the different techniques that are used in creating this cohesion, or in the case of, you know, using these stressed pronouns, you could actually cause it to have less cohesive texture. In the case of exaphoric reference, using a pronoun or a definite marking to refer to something in a situation, no cohesion is created within the text, but possibly intertextuality, which means referring to some other text, or between the text and the situation of some other knowledge. So the very often, like say, if you all knew a particular song, or you knew a particular TV show or something like that, I can make a reference to it, which would be an exaphoric reference possibly, but it would help to somehow create cohesion, or create a context in which we would have some shared knowledge that would help to create cohesion. Or if it's something in the context of the situation, then of course that would create cohesion within that context. The referent can also be the referent referred to by the pronoun can also be some part of the text itself, in the sense of, you know, John said that Mary is really wonderful, and I would like to agree with that, where that refers to Mary is really wonderful. So you're actually referring to as part of the text in that case. We call that, that's like textual anaphor, or textual deixis in some cases. So like if you say, this is what we will do first, Jim will do this, John will do that, where the this is referring to Jim will do this, John will do that, those, you know, what's coming up. Or he has no money, and that is all I'm worried about, whether that refers to him not having any money. So this and that, or in some cases it can refer to a projected clause, it can refer to an idea, it can refer to a fact type clause. Here and there can also be used like this. So you say, now here is an idea whose time has come, computers that can talk. Or free lunches for all professors, nothing wrong there. So here the there refers to free lunches for all professors. And here, when you say now here is an idea to come, the here actually refers to computers that can talk. So, so this is the same as like saying computers that can talk is an idea whose time has come, or there's nothing wrong with free lunches for all professors. So it's again a choice that you make as to how you want to profile this particular situation. So here, you know, because this is kind of a new idea, you might want to put it at the end like that. And so there may be reasons why you would pick one way of doing it as opposed to another. Now, definite marking is seen in this theory as a form of deictic marking. Other theories don't consider it deictic, even though historically it comes from a deictic pronoun. Deixis, again, as I explained when we talked about the noun group, is anything that you need to refer to the time of speaking, the place of speaking, or the people who are speaking in order to understand it. So when I say I, then you have to know who is speaking, or when whoever's saying I, you have to know who is speaking to understand what I means. I, most of the time, refers to the person, but it doesn't have to. It can refer to something to do with the thing. So if I say, I'm in room 0345 now, I'm actually not in room 0345 now, but I can say, you know, that's my office. It's another way of saying my office is 0345. Or I could say, I'm in the last slot by the elevator, which means my car is parked in the last slot by the elevator. So the I can refer to anything to do with the speaker, and the you can refer to anything to do with the addressee. It's the second person. Or or in some cases we say like, oh, you never know, when that you is a non-deictic you, or just kind of general you. But so these things are all deictic, or when you use like tense is deictic. So you know, when you mark past, present, future, because that's all relative to the time of speaking, so that's deictic. So the place, when you talk about place, like here versus there, that's deictic, because it's the only way you know where here is when you know where the speaker is. So, and there means where the speaker isn't. So these are deictic concepts. Now, the developed from the pronoun that. It was an alternate case form. English used to have very complex case forms. Luckily, we've lost all of that. It was very difficult. It's good you don't have to learn 6 different cases and all these genders and 3 genders and number agreement and things like that. Now it's very simple. But in the past there was an instrumental form of the word that, which developed into the word the now. And the reason why some theories don't consider it deictic is because if you think about it, deictic is referring to the speech act in some way. So like if I say this, then it means this thing that's close to the speaker. If I say that, it means something that's far away from the speaker, or not close to the speaker is a better way to put it. But if I say the, it's not telling you, it's telling you you can identify the thing just the way that and this does, but it's not telling you relative to the location of the speaker. So some people will say that the is not really deictic because it's not about the location the way this and that is. But it does help you to identify, or it tells you that you can identify the thing. So when you say the president rather than a president, or the sun rather than a sun, it helps you to identify, because it's saying, okay, he's assuming I know which sun, and since the only one that makes sense is the sun in the sky, then we'll go with that. Or when I say the president, then you will think, oh, he's assuming I can identify which president, so it must be the president of the university. Or maybe, like there was a recent announcement about the President's Awards, that, and they had a picture of Bertel. And so is it Bertel giving out the President's Award, or is it Bertel Anderson, our president, in case you don't know. So the question then in my mind was, is Bertel giving out the award as president of NTU, or was the president of the country giving him an award? And it turned out it was Tony Tan giving our president an award. So there was 2 presidents involved. So one was the president of the country, the other was the president of NTU. And so in other contexts, you usually only have one president mentioned, but in this case we had the president and the president together. But when the president of NTU is with the president of the country, then he kind of loses a little luster. So he just becomes Bertel Anderson, and he's not the president anymore. So these things kind of are very contextual. And this very often, if you do have definite marking in languages, not all languages have definite marking, as you would know. And very often when it does grammaticalize, becomes part of the grammar, it comes from a demonstrative pronoun. Just like I was mentioning the le and la in French, or lo and, all of the demonstrative, the definite marking in Romance languages comes from the Latin demonstrative pronouns. So I covered this, and the third person pronouns present the same sort of situation, that when you say him, I'm kind of assuming you know who I'm talking about, but I'm not telling you how to identify it, other than in English we use gender. So we have this distinction between him, her, and it. So there's what we call a gender distinction or animacy distinction, whereas a lot of other languages like Chinese, there's just ta and you don't know. Although historically or in the past, more recent past, you didn't use ta for inanimate things. You just use it for people. And you generally didn't use it as a subject. So it was kind of leaving things out was more common. And then there's also comparative reference, which is different from co-reference in that you're not referring to the same thing a second time, but you're setting up a contrast relative to some other referent. So if you say Jim Smith was kind, gentle, friendly, and loyal, such a man is not easily forgotten, where the such doesn't refer to Jim Smith, but somebody like Jim Smith. Or you say, she said she had her bag stolen. The same thing happened to me the other day, where the same thing means that her bag was stolen. It means my bag was stolen if I say the same thing happened to me. And he is going out of patriotism. Likewise, you should go. So likewise here meaning for the same reason. So it's not a direct reference, but referring to something similar or in some ways different. His arguments are valid, mine are equally valid. So in order to understand what equally or likewise or same thing or such, again, the thing is you have to think back to what was said here and what was said here and what was said here and what was said here. So by having to think back to what is meant by such or same or likewise or equal, then it creates the cohesion in your mind again. So anything that makes you to kind of think back and forth between parts of the text is going to create cohesion. So one of the things that is used a lot especially in conversation, is ellipsis or substitution. And these are where you actually leave out something or replace it with what's often called a proform. It's just like a pronoun, but it can be proverb. So it refers to a similar identity or state of affairs when you're using substitution. So it's a little bit like comparative reference. With ellipsis, something that's recoverable from the preceding clause is omitted. And in substitution, a form such as one or so is used to mark the omission. So let's look at something. So if you say, with ellipsis, you can have either the entire clause left out or some part of it, such as the verb group or a noun group. And usually ellipsis occurs in response to some statement or question. So that's why I said in dialogue it happens a lot. So if somebody asks you, did you eat all the fish? You could say yes, which means yes, I did eat all the fish. Or you could say yes, I did, where you only put in the mood block, where the I did is the mood block, so you leave out eat the fish. Yes, I did eat the fish. So you have two choices there in terms of ellipsis. But the person, when you just say yes, if you just say yes by itself, that doesn't mean anything. Yes what? Yes, I did eat all the fish. So the person, in order to create that full meaning out of your yes, has to think back and say, what did I just say? Oh, I just asked him about the fish. So when he says yes, it means yes, I did eat all the fish. So that creates cohesion between people. So there's cohesion not only within a single narrative text, but there's cohesion within a conversation. When people are talking to each other, there's this co-creation of cohesion. There's a whole field called conversation analysis, which works on this whole kind of thing, how people create text together. There's what Professor K.K. Luke teaches that in our program. So if you're interested, it's all about interaction between people and how they work together to create the text that appears between people. Again, language is not a thing. It's something that we do, and to the extent that we talk about grammar or we talk about language structure, it's something that emerges, that comes out of this interaction of people in creating the text. So the field that studies that most carefully is conversation analysis, or what Halliday calls, what he does is discourse analysis, which is kind of similar but includes a wider type of data, whereas conversation analysis only looks at conversation. Discourse analysis looks at all types of discourse, so including narratives and things like that. I think you're guilty. Why? So the why, if you just say why, you know, it means why do you think I'm guilty? Or you ate it all, and you say no, I didn't. Where the bit that's left out is I didn't just eat it all. So I didn't replaces, you know, you keep the mood block, or you could leave it out, but you can put in the mood block and leave out the rest of it. Have you been eating well? Yes, I have. And then again, you leave out eating well. Or did you go to sleep early last night? Yes, I did. And you leave out go to sleep early. Is he behaving well? Yes, he is. Let me just answer a question. One of the questions that came up a lot in the questions you've been submitting is, what's the difference between finite and non-finite clauses? Now, basically, is there a finite? That's all it means. So like did, didn't, have, did, is, that's the finite element, right? So that makes it finite. If it doesn't have that, it's not finite. And so in English, we have a choice of finite and non-finite clauses, but any main clause has to be finite, except imperatives. Imperatives don't have finites. But imperative is a special kind. But in most clauses, to be a main clause, it has to have a finite. So the finite is either tense marking or mood marking. Not mood, modality marking. So mood or modality. So it's what we talked about in the beginning as finite, the finite element of the mood block. If it's there, it's a finite clause. If it's not there, it's not finite. So it's this very straightforward kind of thing. So in these cases, what we're putting in here is the mood block, because it's the subject plus the finite. And that's what the mood block is. And you can see how it's used in this interaction back and forth. When you delete the whole clause, or omit the whole clause, then you can also often use so or not, especially if they're projected clauses. So like, did you get them all? I think so means I think I did get them all. Or if not means not get them all. We're in trouble. Perhaps so means perhaps we're in trouble, right? So this not and the so can replace the whole clause there. So that's substitution, where you're substituting the word so or the word not. Or not, you might, it's best to think of it as substitution rather than just ellipsis here. Now in British English, one of the things that you'll notice if you do read the chapter, because Michael Halliday is British, and he still has some British, even though he's been living in Australia for many years, he hasn't changed the way he talks. Purposely, because he's afraid if he tries to talk Australian, the Australians will get angry. I did the same thing when I lived in Australia. I didn't try to talk like them, even though I could if I wanted to, because I was worried they'd get insulted. But they don't like American accent. Anyway, so I got a lot of trouble. Especially when George Bush was president, nobody liked Americans. So I would just say, I'm Canadian, eh? Don't hate me. Anyway. So in British English, they still use this do for verbal groups. So he would say something like, has he bought the tickets? He'd say, I think he must have done. Whereas in American English, you'd say, I think he must have, and you stop there. We don't put that thing. So it's, sometimes we would say do so. I think he must have done so. We could say that, but we wouldn't say, I think he must have done. Now, within the nominal group, the thing can often be omitted. So if you say, I'd like some grapes, there aren't any. So when you say there aren't any, it's kind of understood that you think back, okay, what, there aren't any what? Well, we just mentioned grapes. Now, there's nothing in the grammar, again, that says that when we say any, we mean any grapes. But in our mind, since the only thing we mentioned was grapes, and the idea is that normally when we talk to people, they stay on topic. In other words, what they answer is going to be relevant to what you asked. So in this case, since I asked about grapes, then a person says there aren't any, they're not talking about kumquats. I'm going to assume that they're talking about grapes. So I'll fill in the blank kind of thing. Or do you have any beer bottles? And you say only 6, so you can just use the numerative. So I only have 3 left. I only have 6 left. So the thing, or the head, in this case, it's the thing and the head is the same. That's another question everybody asks, is how do you distinguish head and thing? Most of the time they're the same, except in those kind of measure phrases like, a cup of tea. Then the head and the thing are different. So that's within the noun group. And when you use substitution, you can use the word one or ones, or by a possessive pronoun like none, or none, I mean. So do you have any black olives? No, only green ones. So normally if you have an epithet, you would use the one. Now this is different from the one that's used in Singlish. In Singlish you use one where we don't use one a lot. So I kind of be careful about the difference between the two. So here, after an epithet, you also use yours after an epithet, but in slightly different context. In attributive position, we normally wouldn't use one, whereas you guys would use one in an attributive position. Why you so blur one? That kind of thing. We would say, why you so blur? Well, we wouldn't say blur at all. We would say, why are you so dumb or something, or why are you so unclear about this? So here, so the one here replaces the thing or head, and both actually. And so that's most common with the epithets. Is that a fake Ralph Lauren? Yes, and a good one too. So here it means a good fake Ralph Lauren. Is this your coat? No, that one's mine. So here is, mine is short for my one. Actually, it just comes from my one. And so you say my one, my one, my one, my man, mine. That's how it came about, right? We do that a lot in language. So like none comes from not one. So not one, not one, not one, none, right? So none comes from not one, mine comes from my one, but now we think of them as different words. So they can be used for that kind of substitution as well. He has 12 books, but I have none. So I have not one. I have not one book, but we don't normally say not one anymore. Well, not one of them. You could say that not one of them came, none of them came. Those are equivalent. Although not one came is more emphatic. Both reference and ellipsis have to do with the fact that reference and propositions since you just mentioned them, you don't need to mention them a second time. And so we can, as a dictum in linguistics, we say languages do best what they do most. And there's something, what we call Zipf's law, which is a guy named Zipf created, that you put in the least amount of effort you can to get the maximum amount of effect. So you're trying to achieve your goal, but you don't put in any more effort to achieve your goal than you need to. And this is a general principle. But in linguistics, what that means, or in language, what that means is you don't say any more than you have to. And so if I don't have to repeat this long form over and over again, you can just shorten it with either leaving it out altogether or using a substitution. So you don't need to repeat it in the full form because they've just been mentioned so people are aware of it. So when someone says, did you buy that insurance policy? You have in mind that somebody's talking about buying that insurance policy, so then all you need to answer is yes, or yes, I did. Or yes, and I'm glad I did. where the yes means, yes, I did buy the insurance policy, and yes, I'm glad I did means, yes, I'm glad I bought the, wait. So if you were to say, to fill this whole thing out, yes, and I'm glad I did, you say, yes, I did buy the insurance policy, and I'm glad I did buy the insurance policy. So that would be quite redundant and quite unnecessary, because we can just drop those extra mentions of buy the insurance policy, and then the person can figure out what we left out. But by figuring out what we left out, that creates the cohesion between the two parts of the text. Here, text meaning what everybody's talking about. Okay. And this is true in the noun group as well. If we're talking about cars, we don't not need to keep saying car. We can omit it and use only the new information, like there are 3 here instead of there are 3 cars here. Very often, to avoid referring to the same person over and over again just as he or using the full name, we will use different ways of talking about it. So if you read a news item, and you can pay attention to this when you read a news item, they will say, mention, like I remember reading an article about Mussolini, right, the dictator of Italy during the Second World War, just before the Second World War, and part of it until they got knocked out and hung upside down. So, you know, in this article, they started out talking about Benito Mussolini, and then they called him the dictator, then they called him Il Duce, which is his nickname, and then he, and going back and forth using different forms of reference. So even though you're using different forms of reference, we know he's talking about the same person, and so that creates cohesion as well. If there's an epithet or a classifier, or in Australian English a demonstrative pronoun in the noun group, the indefinite numeral 1 can take the place of the thing also. So if you say there are 3 blue ones here, or there are 3 plastic ones here, or in Australia you can say these ones are okay. In America we just say these are okay, but Australians somehow feel the need to put a 1 in there. So they'll say, oh, these ones are all right. So there's differences even among American, British, and Australian English. Okay, so we'll take a break now and then come back and talk about some other aspects. Okay, let's get back into it. So the third part is lexical cohesion. There's actually a fourth part, which is the conjunction, using the handout I gave you last time. But since we covered a lot of that, I'll just go quickly through that. So lexical cohesion is kind of what I was talking about just now with the example from Mussolini, where you're referring to something, but you refer to it in different ways over and over again, and different ways of characterizing the reference, either synonyms or near synonyms. And so like when you say the bald eagle is a symbol of the United States, yet this bird is in danger of disappearing from the face of the earth. Eagle is a kind of bird, right? So we call that a hypernym, a superordinate term. Again, just means superordinate, again, meaning something above. So we think of it like, you know, you have type of bird, and then you have different types of birds, and eagle. Huh? What? What? What happened? Huh? Penguin. Yeah, penguin is a kind of bird. So eagle and penguin, yes, they don't look very much alike, but they all belong to the category bird. So this is a superordinate term, means it's ordered above these terms. And so when we refer to something, you can use a superordinate term like this bird, where bird, you know, bald eagle is a kind of bird. Or you could say, you know, if you're talking about penguins, you could say this bird. And then people go like, bird? No. Yeah. Well, I have the full set of the Oxford English Dictionary. The book fills up the half of my study, because Oxford English Dictionary is a kind of book, right? It's just like penguin is a kind of bird. English Dictionary is a kind of book. So you can always use a superordinate term, or sometimes called hypernym. There's hypernym and hyponym. Don't worry about these. We're not going to use them in the class, but just, you know, it's the same hyper, like we talk about, you know, hypertaxis and hypotaxis. It just means above, or super. Super and hyper is the same. So superordinate, hyper. But nym is word, means name, right? So it's the name from above or name below. Hypo means below. So anything nym. Oh, I forgot to turn it on. We took Jimmy's kindergarten class on a field trip. The children had a wonderful time. So, you know, if you know it's a kindergarten class, you know, of course, there's a bunch of kids. So we can refer to this class, kindergarten class, as the children, meaning, and people will understand that when we say the children, we're referring to the same people we referred to earlier as the kindergarten class. And so making that connection in our mind creates cohesion. Or we took the train to get there. Rail travel is one of the nicest ways to travel. So here we're talking about rail travel is the same kind of idea as taking a train. But we're just talking about it using two different words, but it still creates cohesion. You could have said taking the train is one of the nicest ways to travel. We heard the sound of an explosion. The noise was deafening. So here the noise refers to the sound of the explosion. And again, it creates cohesion between the two sentences. We went down to Jurong Point yesterday. The mall was unbelievably crowded. So if you know that Jurong Point is a mall, then it makes perfect sense to say the mall. When you know, in this case, there's lots of malls in Singapore, more than any other place I know of on earth. And so it could be lots of things you refer to in the mall. But because we just mentioned Jurong Point, then when you say the mall, somebody, whoever's listening to you, is going to create cohesion by understanding the mall as Jurong Point. He finished the inputting, but as he doesn't know how to type, the typing took a long time. So if you know what inputting is, it usually involves typing, and so you can refer to the inputting as typing, or you might think of it as one aspect of the inputting, the typing. So depending on how you understand inputting, you could either see this as referring to exactly the same thing or at least some aspect of the same thing. But either way, it creates this cohesion. And it may be that when you refer to something more than once, you profile it from a slightly different perspective. So everyone cheered, the leader acknowledged the applause. So cheering is like, yay, right? But applause is like this, right? So they're kind of the same thing, but they're different aspects of the kind of same approval that you would get. He invited us to dinner. We ate all night long, where the eating here, of course, refers to eating the dinner, not anything else. She cried like a baby. Tears streamed down her face. So here you have this lexical connection between crying and tears. And shopping in the mall was fun. We bought all sorts of things. So here we know that when you go shopping, I mean, you can do window shopping where you don't buy anything, but most of the time when you go shopping, you buy something. And so when you mention buying again here, the person has to think back to, okay, we went shopping, and so the buying happened during the shopping trip in the mall. So anything that evokes kind of the elements related to what we call a semantic frame. So when you go shopping, there's all kinds of aspects related to shopping, or when you crying, you know, things related to crying, or going to dinner, there's other things, or like I mentioned with the refrigerator, there are these, once you mention refrigerator, then there's certain things about it. Or if I mention a classroom in NTU, there's certain things that you would expect in every classroom. You know, I can talk about the chairs in the classroom. So all of these are going to create a kind of cohesion in your mind because they're all parts of the same semantic frame in your mind. So there's also referring to parts of things, what we call meronymy. Meros just means part in Greek, and nym, this is the same, nami here just means name, so naming a part. Hyponym means a hyponymy is the same as hyponym, but I probably spelled it wrong. You don't have to be a good speller to be a good linguist. So you can use the name of a part of something or a more specific type of something to refer to it. And this is cohesive, again, relating to these semantic frames. And what we call the principle of local interpretation is very much like when I say, you know, Peter, you know, left his house and went to his car. The principle of local interpretation is that unless they tell you something has changed, nothing has changed. So when we mention Peter and we don't mention anybody else, and then we say him or his, then we assume it's Peter because there's nothing to make us think that anything has changed. So like when we bought a car for only $3,000, the engine is not original, but it runs okay. So here by saying the engine, you assume it's the engine of the car that was just bought for $3,000. And my computer is giving me some trouble. The mouse isn't functioning properly. Where again, your common knowledge of a computer includes that, you know, computers often have a mouse. We're still not sure whether we should call it mice or mouses, but some people say mouses, some people say mice. If you have more than one mouse, computer mouse. Of course, with the little furry things, we call them mice. But it seems funny to say more than one computer mouse is mice. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But here, the cohesion is created by evoking this semantic frame and mentioning different elements from within that same frame, right? When you finish with the toothpaste, be sure to put the cap back on. So, you know, most tubes of toothpaste have a cap. And so when you say the cap, then again, that creates cohesion because you have to think, well, which cap? Well, the cap of the toothpaste. At the kennel, we saw German Shepherds, Pekingese, and a few mixed breeds. So just by mentioning different types of dogs, you're creating cohesion. And especially you also mentioned kennel. So kennel is a place where you keep animals, or especially dogs. At our school, those in professional degrees graduate earlier. A new group of lawyers or MBAs is cranked out every 2 or 3 years. So if you know about academia, professional degrees includes the MDs and the lawyers and a number of other things where you're really just learning to go into a certain profession. And so, or MBAs. So when you mention professional degrees, these are types of professional degrees. So by mentioning them, it creates cohesion with the earlier sentence. And Parisians eat bread every day. It may be a baguette, croissant, or dinner rolls. So mentioning types of bread, these are all three are types of bread. And so by mentioning them after mentioning the word bread, then it creates cohesion within that text. Of course, I'm just using 2 sentences here, but in the tutorial, you'll use a larger text, and you'll look for these referential chains throughout the text, and look for things that kind of pointing you in different directions within the text. In the book, they talk about collocation, and this is similar to what we've been talking about, where different items within a single semantic frame are mentioned together and help in establishing cohesion. So he sat puffing on his pipe, the smoke curled slowly up into the sky, whereas when you smoke on a pipe, of course we know that smoke comes out, although they have new electronic cigarettes that supposedly don't make smoke. I haven't tried one, but anyway, that's what they say. But normally, when you say the smoke, you would think it meant smoke from pipe. I went up north to ski, but the lift was broken, so we couldn't do much skiing. Again, when you go to ski, if you've been skiing, you know that there's a lift to take you up on the hill, because skiing means you're going down the hill. So how do you get back up the hill? Either you can trudge up the hill if you want, but nobody ever does that. You have a lift that carries you up. It lifts you up the hill. If you go skiing, then you can talk about the lift, and everybody will know what you're talking about. We all went out, and also it creates cohesion. We all went on a picnic. Jim brought the food, and Joan brought the drinks. So when you go on a picnic, of course, it means you take food with you and go out somewhere where you don't normally eat, and you eat. And so the food and the drinks refers to what you ate when you were on your picnic, right? So it's evoking a particular semantic frame, and these things are all things that if you were to do a computer search, for example, using a large corpus, and you do a collocational search, in other words, you try to find out what things appear together, you're going to most likely find things like food and drink occurring with picnic, or lift occurring with ski. And so these are, the book talks about this a little bit as setting up expectations. So this is another aspect of cohesion, is that I haven't gone into it too much. I mentioned it when we talked about theme, that there's this aspect what we call projection. So that when somebody's talking, we don't wait for them to finish talking. We are already kind of projecting what they're going to say. We're already guessing what they're going to say. And so this kind of lexical collocation is helping you to a certain extent to project what's coming. And so you're, as Michael Halliday talks about, you're expecting it. You're expecting to hear, when somebody mentions something like picnic, you expect to hear about food and drinks. And so when it comes along, it helps create that cohesion as well. Because it kind of, you had already been thinking it was coming, and then when it does come, you say, oh yeah, there it is. And then, it makes that tie in your mind. Now, what's weird is antonyms can also do the same thing. So things like I mentioned with the song, where you talk about morning and night, and as we think of kind of antonymic, they can also create a sense of cohesion because of the contrast between them. So like I say, to be comfortable and get along well in the world, keep your mind open and your mouth shut, your belly full and your bowels empty, and your head cool and your feet warm, right? So it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but even if it doesn't make sense, you think it sounds erudite because somehow just having these contrasts in there, I mean, you get a lot of these kind of folk sayings where they contrast these things, which makes it seem like a nice cohesive statement, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense. But so somehow just having these contrastive pairs really ties it together and makes it seem substantial. Something like the paradox of our time in history is that we have taller buildings but shorter tempers, wider freeways but narrower viewpoints. We spend more but have less. We buy more but enjoy it less, right? So that sounds really wonderful, except, of course, having taller buildings has nothing to do with shorter tempers. But just by linking them together like this, using these antonyms, makes it seem like they're connected. Makes it seem like they have something to do with each other. So when you're reading, pay attention to how people use this technique to try to link things together that don't really belong together. Because this happens a lot. People do this a lot in their writing. They will use these contrasts as to make it look like these things are really, contrasting in real life, and they're not. So having a wider freeway isn't going to be related to having narrower viewpoints, but it's just, the idea, whoever wrote this, makes it, kind of wants you to think about things, but there's certainly no causal connection between them. We have multiplied our possessions but reduced our values. We talk too much, love too seldom, and hate too often. So again, having these contrasts connects it all together and somehow makes it feel much stronger. So it's a technique, a useful technique when you're writing to do this, although, again, these things really don't have much to do with each other. Although you might say multiplying your possessions, you reduce your values, but here they don't mean valuing the possessions, I think. Okay, this is the text you're going to have. So I'm not going to go through this now. I'm going to go do quickly on the cohesion. Conjunction, I mean. Ayo, that didn't work out. This is the wrong PDF, so. Oops, that's not going to work either. So with conjunction is another way. We talked a lot about this when we talked about clause and group complexes. Someone actually asked, what's the difference between the lecture on groups and the other lecture on group complexes? Well, one is when you have more than one group together. So that was the difference between the two. One is just the group, and one is when you have more than one group together. So conjunctive, we talked about, a lot of people ask, what's the difference between conjunction and conjunctive adjuncts? Conjunction is a grammatical marker that grammatically links two clauses together and creates a new structure. I mentioned this when we talked about this initially. So whereas a conjunctive adjuncts only creates semantic cohesion, it only allows you to think back, but it doesn't create a different grammatical structure. So if I say, John went to the store and bought a magazine, the and there actually creates a new structure out of the two clauses, so they become one conjoined sentence. That's why they're called conjunctions, because it conjoins these things. Whereas a conjunctive adjunct is just an adjunct. In other words, it's something you could use or not use, and it doesn't change the structure. So if I say, John went to the store, while there, he bought a magazine. While there, the there, actually, with conjunctive adjuncts, there's very often a deictic element or some mention of place or person that helps you to connect back to there. So when I say, while there, the there would refer to the store. He bought a magazine. So that would be a conjunctive adjunct, and it doesn't make the two sentences into one sentence, but it helps you to link the two sentences together semantically in your mind. So when we have, so the conjunctions like and, or, but, yet, so, then, with so, there are a lot of people asked about so. There are different so's in English, so you have to be careful. So there's so, which means like because or therefore, like when I say so, you have to be careful. And then there's like, so, how you been? Which doesn't really mean therefore. And then there's so I did so, where the so there means like what, you know, it's a substitute for what you just mentioned. So if you say, did you break the thing? I did so. You know, you can put the so there. And so it helps create cohesion. I mean, if you just said, we have no money, we can't go out, in your mind you could link those two together and create cohesion and say that, okay, we can't go out is because we have no money. But if you use a conjunction here, we have no money, so we can't go out, then it's making the connection between the two and the type of relationship between the two clauses more clear. So you've got the same types of things we talked about, the elaboration, when you have apposition, where you're just putting them together, like he's a thief, that is, he is a crook, or I'm leaving today, in other words, I quit. The house has been repossessed by the bank, and the bank account is empty, in other words, we're broke. So these are helping to create cohesion with the other ones. I mean, you don't have to use them. That's why they're called adjuncts in these cases. You don't really have to have them, but it just helps in creating the cohesion. And then sometimes you do an exemplification where you use for instance, or thus, or for example, like the house came with a number of extras. For example, it has a jacuzzi and a steam shower. I mean, you don't have to use these. This again, a conjunctive adjunct, and you don't have to use it, but it just makes it clear that the thing that's following is going to be an example of what came before. So the house came with a number of extras, and then you're going to give an example of what you mean by having a number of extras. It has a jacuzzi and a steam shower. And sometimes we do these things for clarification. We put in conjunctive adjuncts like or rather, or at least, or to be more precise, or by the way, or incidentally, or in any case, anyway. So all of these things help the person in interpreting the relationship between the different sentences that you're using. So this guy has tricked you to be more precise. He robbed you of $50, which you're correcting yourself. He's a good man, or rather he's a good policeman. Again, you're correcting yourself. Or you say, I love pie, in particular I love apple pie, where you're particularizing what you love. And then in extensions, you can be adding something like he's a crook. In addition, he's mean to little kids. We're going to the store for bread. Also, we need to stop at the video store for a tape. Wow, that's an old sentence. Nobody goes to the video store anymore for a tape. Do you know that we used to have video stores? And we used to watch tapes. And then enhancement, there are 4 types of enhancement, which enhancement, a lot of people ask what's the difference between enhancement and elaboration. Enhancement always has a circumstantial meaning. Elaboration doesn't really give you a different meaning. It just is kind of elaborating on the first part in just kind of clarifying it or something. Whereas enhancement is adding some kind of circumstantial meaning. So like we saw him standing in the field, nearby there were cows of different, several different types. So nearby is a circumstantial meanings, meaning near the place where he was standing in the field, or around the corner is a church. Behind that, again, is circumstantial, so behind the church. And you can only smoke in the designated areas. Anywhere else is off limits, so anywhere here referring to anywhere than the designated areas. Or she was robbed on 34th Street. In the same place last year, someone else was robbed. So in the same place, meaning in 34th Street. Put the dough into the blender, then while it is blending, mix up the sauce. So the then means after you finish putting the dough in the blender, you do then you start the blender and then mix up the sauce. And I spotted him in the distance and prepared to shoot. Just then, means just as I was preparing to shoot, blinding light appeared. So these are things that, you know, they're related. Circumstantial, of course, meaning the when, where, how, or why of the other thing. So here they mainly I gave you where and when, but it could be any of those kind of meanings. So these things help you to create the cohesion and understand the relationship between the clauses. So manner is another one. So like he's left out the baking soda, likewise, you've left it out too. So in the same way, likewise means in the same way, so that's manner. An isosceles triangle has 3 sides, similarly, so kind of like similar way. A square has 4 sides. So all of these are types of manner. Then you have causal, conditional, like I haven't got any money, so we can't go. He's going to the party as a devil, then I can't go as a devil. So you notice again here, like with then I can't go, you have the same words sometimes that have more than one function. And this is something that a lot of you have been confused about, that it's not a matter of the words used, but how they're used. So like we just had then as marking a temporal enhancement sense. So you do this, then you do that. But here we have, he's not going to the party, then I can't go as devil. That's not temporal, that's causal. So this one is like he's going to the party, because of that I can't go as a devil. So the then here means because of that, or since that is the case, I can't go as a devil. Or consequently, it's kind of like consequently, the then there. So it's not about the words. Again, always our mantra, you know, what is the meaning? What is the meaning? And then you have these conditional ones, like in that case or under the circumstances. Matter on that point. So he thinks all eggs should be blue. On that point, he's wrong. So on that point, referring to that all eggs should be blue. She said the government will give money to the poor in that respect, meaning in the respect of giving money to the poor, they are doing something good. So there's a table that gives an overview and summary of this kind of stuff. Okay. Any comments or questions about any of this stuff? So really, it's all about anything in the text or anything. Yeah, anything that helps you to create cohesion or to make sense of a text, right? Because we want to make sense. A text by itself doesn't make any sense. The sense of a text is created in your own mind. The written language or spoken language doesn't make sense on its own. It only makes sense when it's interpreted by a person. Don't pack up yet. We're not done yet. We're not done yet. Everybody, as soon as I finish the slide, I want to answer some questions, so don't run away yet. We still got 20 minutes or so. I got a lot of questions. This is only a time. I got a pile now this big from all the ones you've been giving me. But I go through them and then I pick out ones. A lot of them are repeats. Okay, if there's no question on this, I'm going to answer some of the questions from the truth slips. One question the person asked about, are embedded expansions a whole separate analysis from the subtypes of expansion like elaborating, extending, and enhancing? No, not really. Because they are embedded expansions, they have the same kind of meanings as the other expansions, but in this case they're embedded. So we don't really break it down that much because it's only helping you to identify the head. So when you have an embedded expansion like the man you know, sleeping near the table or something like that, then it's helping you to identify what it is. And so it's an expansion, but it's doing something different than when it's at the clause level. It's just helping you to identify that referent. Well, another big question that people had was how to distinguish hypotaxis and parataxis. Is the conjunction the most important? Certainly if you have a paratactic conjunction, then yeah, they're going to be, like if you have and or but, it's going to be generally everything I say is always generally. Nothing is hard and fast. I know you'd like to have hard and fast rules. You can say, oh, this, and this. It's never like that because, again, it's human behavior. It's not a logical system. So generally, things do go in a certain way, but not always the same way. So if you see an and, then it's generally going to be paratactic. If you see a but, most of the time it's going to be paratactic, but there's some exceptions. And when you see something like when as a conjunction, then it's always going to be, in that case, we could say always going to be hypotactic. Or therefore, not therefore, that's not a conjunction. That's a conjunctive adjunct. With something like when or what's another good conjunctive adjunct that's hypotactic? If. So if you have something like if, then it's always going to be hypotactic, right? And then there was this question about in the verb complexes, when you have an enhancing sense of it, it's the first verb. The first verb is considered the primary verb. So when you say like keep running, or some of the other examples that we use, it's the first verb that it carries the meaning of enhancement or extending or whatever, not the second verb. The whole thing together is one process. And people ask, how do you distinguish an event and process? Halliday is not really very clear on that. And usually when we use the words event and process, they're pretty much the same meaning. But basically, you can think of it as that, well, there's two verbs involved. But when they together, when you say like begin cutting or stop using your phone, then that's really one process that we're talking about, even though I've used two verbs to express it. Now, in some cases, when I say like I gave this stop feeding the monkeys or stop to feed the monkeys, now it seems like those are parallel, but in one case, there are clearly two actions. Stop to feed the monkeys. You stop and then you feed the monkeys. Whereas stop feeding the monkeys is you're feeding the monkeys and then you just stop. And so it's really one thing happening rather than two. So it's, again, it goes back to the meaning. You have to always see what the meaning is in terms of understanding it. Is it possible for a clause complex to comprise expansion and projection elements? If you had a number of different clauses together, then certainly, yeah, you can have those things all together. I mean, if you have lots of clauses gone together, but they wouldn't be within a single clause. So like John told Mary, it's a sunny day, but I still prefer to stay indoors. So it's an expansion within the projection. That's correct. So the quoted part has an expansion, and then the thing is a projected clause altogether. With paratactic versus hypotactic, a lot of people asked, when you say something like, he said, I don't want to go, why is that paratactic, even though he said is technically dependent on the quoted dialogue? It's not, when you say paratactic, it's not, or when you say, like another question came up earlier was, when you have a main clause versus a subordinate clause, or a main bit, as opposed, the main bit normally can stay by itself, but in some cases, it's just a matter of paratactic not just meaning stand by itself, but it really goes back to the meaning that the two are at the same level, right? Paratactic means the same order or same level, as opposed to hypotactic where one depends on the other. So it's not, in most cases they can stand alone, but it's never a hard and fast rule. Someone was asking, like, the man with the big nose, why is with identified as a process? Isn't it a nominal group? Yeah, it's a nominal group, the man with the big nose, but the post modifier, which is the same thing as qualifier. Somebody asked, is there a difference between post modifier and qualifier? It's the same thing. Its post modifier tells you about its position. Qualifier tells you what it's doing. right? So one is a functional label, one is a positional label. So post modifier means it's a modifier that comes after the head. Qualifier means it's qualifying the head in some way. So they're the same thing. But in this case, the man with the big nose, so with here is a minor process, not a major process. And someone asked, what is a major process then? Well, major process is the main verb in a clause, and the minor process is the preposition phrase, the prepositions. And we treat them as minor processes because in many languages they are actually verbs, and then also because they take complements like a verb does, and in many ways they act like verbs. Yeah, so like he tends to talk a lot. Why is this considered temporal enhancement? And the person understood to talk a lot doesn't seem like a circumstance. So in this case, to tend to talk a lot, it's not to talk a lot that's the enhancing, even though that's marked as XB. It's the tend part that actually has the enhancing sense, because tend means to do often, right? So he tends to do that means he does it often. So that's the temporal enhancement there. So it's the first part that's carrying the thing, even though the second part is marked as if it is. Why does Halliday consider adjective with adjective to be a nominal group? I think I mentioned this in class, but in English, at least in some analyses, adjectives are a kind of noun. They're not a separate, they are separate to a certain extent, but they're more like nouns than they are like verbs. So Halliday treats them all as nominals, not as nouns, but nominals. And so they are considered an adjective, and an adjective can be considered a nominal group. What is the importance of determining whether a secondary clause is finite or non-finite? Well, as we saw with the examples that I gave you, well, I didn't use non-finite clauses there, but I gave you some examples of the difference between using a paratactic, hypotactic with finite clause and paratactic, hypotactic with non-finite clause. So there's a strength to it. So a finite clause is always going to be a stronger statement than a non-finite clause. And so when you're interpreting or writing a text, you have the choice of using a kind of weaker form. The weakest form is to just have like a preposition phrase. But a slightly stronger form is to have a non-finite hypotactic clause. A slightly stronger form than that would be a finite hypotactic clause. And then a much stronger form would be to have the paratactic finite clause. Paratactic is always going to be finite. Both clauses will be finite. But hypotactic, you have a choice of finite versus non-finite. And so a finite clause is really saying something, whereas you're kind of making it real. Whereas with a non-finite clause, it's just kind of not as strong, not as real. So like, if I say, although there are a lot of mistakes, your paper were very good, right? So that's hypotactic. Although there are a lot of mistakes, that's finite. But you could say, although full of mistakes, your paper was quite good. Or you could say, although having a lot of mistakes, which is also non-finite. Or, you could say it has a lot of mistakes, then it would be paratactic. In the verbal groups consisting of two or more verbs, like has, had me, made me feel, how do you determine which would be the head? It's always going to be the first one is the head, and the last one is going to be kind of in other words, it's always going to be alpha, beta, gamma, or ABC going in that direction. There's never any different one. So just always going to be that, just ABC with the first one as the head. And one asked if there are three types of groups, nominal, verbal, and adverbial. Should two or more of these be combined in one complex clause? Will we then analyze them individually? one of the things that seemed to come through the questions is that some people don't know the difference between clause and group, or clause and phrase. So a clause will include generally groups and phrases, but a group and a phrase is not a clause. And so they're different. One is a constituent of the other. So a group or a phrase is going to be a constituent of a clause. So the clause includes a predicator and in some cases finite in the mood block. And so with these kind of things, like the example given is, she couldn't have been going to eat that juicy, sumptuous looking Angus beef steak with the side of potatoes. This is actually a very simple clause where she is the subject, couldn't have been going to eat is a verb complex, and that juicy, sumptuous looking Angus beef steak with the side of potatoes is just one noun group. So together they all form one clause, but it's three groups. So one is she is a noun group by itself, and then couldn't have been going to eat is a verb group by itself, and that juicy, sumptuous looking Angus beef steak with the side of potatoes is one noun group. So it's really only three constituents in the clause. It sounds complicated, but it's three constituents at the clause level. So then within each of those, you analyze how they fit, how it works within each one, and then you can see how they fit together to create the clause. Near the wall, someone asked, he also asked about, the tutorial example, he bought the lovely thick green carpet with the long tassels near the wall. This sentence was split into three nominal groups with tassels, carpet, wall being the things of each group. The wall is a thing within the complement, the wall, but near the wall is a preposition phrase. And the man is digging frantically in the ditch. In the ditch is also a preposition phrase, not the whole clause. Somebody said something really good. Right? Last time I talked about the difference between epithet and classifier, and someone asked, is using an intensifier such as very to identify an epithet always helpful? That's a pretty good one, actually, because with a classifier, you generally won't be able to say very. So I wouldn't say that's a very wooden table, or that's a very metal chair. But you could say that's a very lovely chair, or it's a very green chair, or it's a very big table. So the epithets, very often you can use an intensifier like very. Whereas with classifiers, again, I never would say never, but so I never say never, actually. But I just said never. But anyway, most of the time, it will work well that way. Just use this. Okay. It would actually help if you typed, because it takes me a long time to figure out sometimes what is actually being read. What written, I mean. This one I can't really read. And going back to this question again of classifier and epithet, can square be a classifier for pizza? Since square pizzas are uncommon, can it be said that the adjective square represents a purpose of the pizza? Not a purpose, a type of pizza. But square, I think, we don't normally say, well, I want to buy a square pizza versus I want to buy a round pizza. So we don't think of those as types of pizza, but you can say, well, I want to get a margarita, and and it came back, you say, what, you give me a square pizza? Where you weren't expecting a square pizza, you were expecting a round pizza, but we don't think of it as a type of pizza. Whereas margarita or, Hawaiian or whatever, even though Hawaiian is an abomination, you should never make that. Those are types of pizza, and whereas square pizza is not really a type of pizza, so I would consider that just an epithet. Someone was asking, speaking of food, someone was saying they went and they had barbecued chicken and was hoping to get barbecued chicken and didn't get barbecued chicken. They got boiled or steamed chicken with barbecue sauce on it. And we actually, last week, we had a talk and we ordered pizza, and one of the pizzas said barbecued pizza. And when we opened it up, we all kind of looked at each other and it's like, what does it mean to be barbecued pizza? And then Ivan said it just means you poured barbecue sauce on it. And so, you know, language is very fluid. You might expect it to mean one thing and it just, person is using it to mean something else. So this is the way things are. The communication is never guaranteed. There's always going to be room for misunderstanding. So get used to that. Don't blame people when you misunderstand what they said. It's not their fault. It's not your fault. That's just the way communication is. And communication, just get used to the idea that miscommunication happens all the time. And so don't get so upset when it happens. Just try to understand why it's happening. It makes you a much better person. So linguistics can make you a better person. What's the difference between a group and a phrase? This is the last one. Last group and a phrase I also went through. It's like a phrase is with a preposition. And as we said, preposition is a minor process. So it's seen as a reduced clause. And you can see that when you use a paradigmatic thing like I was just saying, you can say, you know, either with a preposition phrase or a type of clause to express a similar meaning. So a noun group, a group is an expanded noun, or a verb group is an expanded verb, whereas a phrase is a reduced clause. And so it's a preposition phrase, another word for preposition phrase. And some people also are still confused about adjunct. Adjunct just means something that's not necessary, and most of the time, or many times, an adjunct is going to be a preposition phrase, but not 100%, because adverbials are adjuncts most of the time, and then you have these adjunct phrases, like we just talked about conjunctive adjuncts, and you have modal adjuncts. So adjunct just means something that's not necessary, and there can be many types of adjuncts. Okay, any comments, questions? Otherwise, this time you can pack up and get going. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.